Thanks for joining us on a road trip through rabbinic narrative. No agenda, just clarity. There's an Aggadah Gemara Shabbos that describes a conversation between Dovid HaMelech and Hashem, where Dovid's asking Hashem for a public sign that he was forgiven for the sin about Sheva. Hashem was willing to grant him that sign, but he told him that he couldn't do it during his lifetime. It could only be granted once Dovid passes away in Shlomo HaMelech's life. So we wanted to take up the question, if Hashem is willing to grant him this public display of forgiveness, why couldn't he do it during David's life? Why did he have to wait until after he passes away? So in order to answer this question, let's go to the Gemara and see what we're able to come up with. It's a Gemara in Talmud Bavli, Mesechus Shabbos, Daf Lamed, Amud Aleph, right where the wide lines begin. And it says, Davar Acher, Vishabeach Ani V'gomer, Kid Rav Yehuda Amarav, Domer Rav Yehuda Amarav, Mi Os Latova V'yiru Sonai Ve'ivoshu. This is quoting a pasuk in Tehillim, where Dovid HaMelech is saying, make for me a good sign so that my enemies can see and be embarrassed. So the Gemara interprets this pasuk and describes a certain conversation that took place between Dovid HaMelech and Hashem. Amar David Levnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono Shel Olam, Macholi ala oso avon. So David said to Hashem, forgive me for that sin, referring to the sin about Sheva. Amar lo macholach. So Hashem said, you're forgiven. Amar lo, so David responded, Asei mi os b'chayai. Make a sign for me during my lifetime. Amar lo, b'chayach ani eini modea, b'chayai Shlomo bincha ani modea. So Hashem said, listen, in your lifetime, I can't do that. But in the lifetime of Shlomo, your son, I'll be able to do it. So Rashi references Al Oso Oven. This is the oven of Sheva, which we know is a pretty monumental event in David's life. And apparently he wanted a sign, a public sign, so that everybody would be aware that Hashem forgave him. It wasn't just enough for him to have the knowledge that Hashem forgave him, but he wanted everyone to be aware of it. The Gemara continues, when the Beis HaMikdash was built, it was time to bring the Aron into the Kodesh HaKadashim, Dafku Sha'arim Zeh Bazeh. So the gates stuck together. They wouldn't allow Shlomo in. So the Gemara goes on with a little bit back and forth with some great imagery in terms of Shlomo HaMelech and his need to recognize what his Malchus means relative to the true Melech HaOlam, God. But we're going to skip to the point that we'd like to focus on, where the Gemara continues, Kivan Sha'amar, so since Shlomo HaMelech said, Hashem Elokim al tashe pnei mishchecha zachra lechaste David avdecha miyad na'ana. When Shlomo basically made a declaration that Hashem, don't turn away from your Mashiach and remember the chasadim of David, your servant. So then he was answered, at that moment, all of the faces of the haters of David, they turned dark like the charred bottom of a pot. And everybody knew at that point in time that Hashem forgave Dovid HaMelech for that sin, the sin of Sheva. So we wanted to understand what's going on behind this narrative between David and Hashem. And what's the lesson here? What's the message here? So just going back to the beginning, let's figure out what is it that David was asking for. To a certain extent, what exactly does he want? Hashem told him that he was forgiven. David had the chait of Sheva. He was involved in an intense form of sincere teshuvah. God told him that he accepted his teshuvah, so what else did he want? So apparently that wasn't enough for David, because David wasn't just an individual who had a relationship with Hashem, but he was the Melech, and he existed in the public framework as well, and he wanted it to be evident to everybody that he was forgiven, and that Shlomo was a legitimate heir to the throne. It's not good for the leader of the nation to have people who are holding grudges against him and being suspicious of any of his motives, or suspicious of his teshuvah, or suspicious of his relationship with Hashem. So he wanted Hashem to make some kind of a sign that everybody should know that he was forgiven, and let's move on. Seems like a legitimate request considering his position amongst the nation. So Hashem responds B'chayecha eini modia. In your lifetime, I can't do it. B'chayai Shlomo bincha ani modia. But I can do it in the time of Shlomo. So we'd like to understand what's that answer. Which one is it? If it's appropriate to do so that everybody can know, so then what's the difference whether he's alive or not? If you can do it, so do it while I'm alive. And if you can't do it, what's going to change once I've passed away and Shlomo's taken over? At the end of the day, is it appropriate or not? When you look to the next part of this story, so it becomes very interesting because that Shlomo HaMelech, in order for him to, so to speak, finish the building of the Beis HaMikdash and bring the Shekhinah to dwell there, he needed to recognize that he wasn't just getting this out of his own merit, but he was able to do this because of the merit of his father David. That's what it means that the Sha'arim wouldn't open until he stated that fact, and he announced that this was Zarcha Lechasid David Avdecha. That's what, so to speak, the gates of the Beis HaMikdash wanted to hear, that he shouldn't think that this was coming due to his own merits, but they were coming because he was the child of David and he was continuing in his legacy. But what's interesting is Ba'osa Sha'a Nefchil Pnei Kol Sonei David Keshulei Kideir. So the description here we think is actually very important, right? That in that moment, the faces of all those who hated David basically turned into burnt food at the bottom of a pot. So first of all, who are these Sonei David? So Rashi says they were Mishpachas Shaul Shimbi V'chayotzibo, right? They were of the family of all the people who had grievances against him, and they still held a lot of grudges, and they still were refusing to recognize the full acceptance of David as the Melech, and they were still holding on to that. But it wasn't until now, it wasn't until the Tefillah of Shlomo was answered and the Aron was brought into the Kodesh HaKodashim that at that point, it was pretty much done for them to say whatever grudges or grievances they had against David. So it was over. Not only was it over, but it basically turned it into the charred bottom of a pot. So we wanted to understand what exactly does this mean? What's the metaphor of the charred bottom of a pot? We wanted to suggest that while it's true that David did do a terrible hate and that he was involved in a very sincere and intense process of teshuvah, and that teshuvah was accepted by Hashem, what this Chazal seemed to be indicating is that nevertheless, there is a sensitivity that we need to have towards the people against whom we've caused a grievance. Meaning to say, even though you yourself did the teshuvah process, even though you corrected the flaw that you had and whatever caused you to do the hate, the bottom line is that you don't exist on an island alone, but you exist in a society where things that you do are going to have an effect on other people, and other people are going to feel slighted by you, and they're going to feel like you've done something against them. And it seems like Hashem is saying is that I need to respect that. That is a legitimate feeling on their part. And that's not something that I want to address nor make them feel bad about, because that is a legitimate feeling and they have a right to feel that way and express that feeling to a certain degree. So if that's the case, that would explain why in his lifetime, perhaps Hashem didn't want to do it, because again, with David being around and always being a reminder of what was done, when the person's alive, it's very hard to ask of somebody who has a legitimate feeling of grievance to just get rid of that, because they see the person, it's manifest, and they have a right to feel that way. But once the person passes away, so now the person's gone, and what was done is done. And now you should be able to be in a position to accept the fact that there's an obvious manifestation from Hashem that David was forgiven, that he did engage in legitimate teshuvah, and it was accepted by Hashem, and that he is supposed to be the leader of Malchus, and his progeny is supposed to be also involved in Malchus, which is what this whole description of Shlomo is. So then if you're still maintaining that grievance, so you've overstepped. No longer is it an appropriate feeling. No longer is it an appropriate expression on your part. Now it's just, so to speak, overdone, overcooked. That's what it means, that their faces turn dark like the charred bottom of a pot. At a certain point, it's appropriate, it's normal, but you reach a certain point where it's overdone. And that's something that they have to realize as well. The reason why we thought this was so interesting is not just because of the particular storyline that Chazal are trying to depict here between Dovid and the Sony Dovid and how that fits into Shlomo, but it could also just teach you a lesson in terms of how you relate to people yourself who you've offended or who you have harmed. I think we all have a tendency to think that once we do teshuvah, assuming that it's sincere and done according to halacha, we think that, okay, I'm done. And the person who I offended needs to get over it right away. And it's not fair that they should hold it against me. This narrative is saying, listen, while it might be true that you did your teshuvah and you took care of your responsibility vis-a-vis the offense, you still need to recognize that the person you offended still has a right to be upset about it, still has a right to hold the grudge against you. However, even though that's the case, still, on the flip side, there comes a point in time where that grievance held against you is not legitimate anymore, and it's, so to speak, overdone. And that's when it becomes a responsibility of the other party to basically say, okay, I need to get past this, and I can't look at you or I can't treat you as the offender forever. It doesn't define you, and it shouldn't define my relationship with you, and it's time to move on. Now, of course, we don't have the relationship with Hashem that Dovid had, nor do we play the same role relative to Bnei Yisrael that Dovid and Shlomo did. But in terms of our relationships with other people and seeing how we need to allow them time to get over the offense that we caused up to a certain point, and after that we should be able to reestablish the relationship and not have to tread and tiptoe around them so that they shouldn't feel they have this endless privilege of just holding this against us. This idea reminded me of a sermon I once read from Rabbi Norman Lamb. It's actually titled The Ethics of Protest. He raises the question in Parshas Noach, why is it that those who were the victims of the violence or the robbery that was committed during the time of the Dor HaMabul, why were they also punished? There's a medrash that actually comes along and blames them as well for overreacting to the robbery. And he says like this: true, an injury was done to them, but their protest was incommensurate with the degree of that injury. This excess of the protest over the wrong was in itself an injustice. And he points out towards the end of the sermon, so the ethics of protest calls upon us to criticize and react to evil, but it bids us not to do so out of proportion. For to overreact is to be guilty of injustice, of being socially disruptive, untruthful, and faithless. To protest, yes, but never out of proportion to the wrong. It seems to be in line with the idea that the Gemara is trying to illustrate, which is that we all need to recognize that in the case of a wrongdoing towards another person, there's a legitimate protest that a person can have because of the grievance caused against them. However, it has to be proportionate. So on the one hand, we need to allow for it, and we need to appreciate it, and we need not to rush it or discount it. On the other hand, it is a responsibility of the offended party not to get out of proportion, not to turn it into something more than it actually is, and when the time is appropriate, to look past it so that the relationship can be restored. Thanks so much for listening. In our next episode, we're going to take up a really strange Rashi that suggests that Moshe was preparing for the Chet HaEgel at the time of Matan Torah. See you on the next road trip.